There's a structure standing in Leipzig, Germany, that doesn't belong to our timeline. It looks like something extracted from a science fiction film about alien civilizations, a dark fortress rising from the earth like a warning. But officially, we're told it's just a monument, just a memorial to a battle that happened over 200 years ago. The problem is, nothing about this structure makes sense. Not its appearance, not its timing, not the symbolism carved into its walls. And when you start digging into the history of monuments from that era, you discover something far more disturbing than architectural oddities. You discover that an entire century of history might have been fabricated, written not by those who lived through it, but by those who needed to hide what really happened. Let me show you something that will change how you see the past. The year 1812 is supposed to be a watershed moment in human history. In America, they call it the War of 1812. In Russia, the Patriotic War. In Germany, the Battle of the Nations. Different names for conflicts that supposedly reshaped the world. Events this momentous should have been immortalized immediately. That's what humans do. We build monuments while the memory is fresh, while the pain and triumph are still raw. We need to see our victories carved in stone. Look at World War II. Less than a year after Germany's surrender, the Soviet military administration decided to convert military graves into full-fledged memorials. By May 1949, just 4 years after the fighting ended, a grand military complex opened in Treptow Park. This is natural human behavior. You don't wait. You honor the dead while witnesses are still alive, while the nation is united in grief and pride. But the War of 1812, this supposedly colossal event that changed the fate of entire states, was met with a century-long silence. No monuments appeared in 1815, none in 1820. The mass construction of memorials dedicated to these events began only approaching the centennial in 1912 and 1913. Think about the absurdity of this. In a world without radio, television, or internet, where the vast majority of people couldn't read or write, the monument in the city square was the most effective propaganda tool available. It was how rulers communicated greatness to the masses. Yet for 100 years after this supposedly great victory, nothing was built. No statues, no triumphal arches, no temples of remembrance. Why would you wait a century to commemorate the defining event of your nation's history? The answer should be obvious. Either the victory was forgotten, which makes no sense, or in the 19th century, this event wasn't given the significance that was attributed to it later. Someone in the early 20th century made a deliberate decision to resurrect this topic, launching a large-scale campaign to construct memory where none existed. And suddenly, as if on command, obelisks and temples in honor of events 100 years prior began appearing all over the world. But here's where it gets interesting. When you examine the few structures officially dated to the 19th century, their biographies look rewritten. Their original purposes appear to have nothing to do with the War of 1812. Take the famous Triumphal Arch in Moscow. This structure is officially considered one of the main symbols of victory in the Patriotic War. According to the approved version, it was designed by architect Osip Bove and erected in honor of Russian triumph. The commemorative inscription states these triumphal gates were laid as a sign of memory of Russian warriors in 1814. Case closed, right? But when you turn to archival data and documentary evidence from the late 19th century, this neat version crumbles. First, the design is strikingly standardized. The Moscow Arch resembles similar structures scattered all over the globe. Characteristic winged creatures, chariots, antique decor, all identical to triumphal gates in Italy, France, Africa, India. It's like looking at a franchise, a global architectural template adapted to local needs, not a unique monument of national glory. In documents from 1883, this structure appears simply as triumphal gates, with no rigid link to a specific date or war. And here's the most intriguing part. On old archival images, the commemorative inscriptions that today serve as proof of the arch's dedication to 1812 are either completely absent, completely unreadable, or intentionally destroyed. Throughout the 19th century, the main evidence linking these gates to the war with Napoleon was virtually non-existent. Clarity appeared only in the early 20th century. In 1912, as part of large-scale preparations for celebrating the centenary of the Battle of Borodino, the arch underwent major restoration. During this work, The facade was cleaned so thoroughly, they apparently removed any remnants of original information and hung brand new sparkling plaques with the necessary ideological text. We know about the true purpose of this structure exclusively from the words of 20th century historians who styled the monument for the Jubilee date. Until 1912, the arch stood nameless or carried a different meaning that was erased for the sake of creating a patriotic myth. You might think this is just peculiarity of Russian record-keeping, that in pedantic Europe things would be different. German precision and love of order are legendary, but when you travel to Germany, the situation becomes even more confusing and mystical. The grandiose memorial complex known as the Hall of Liberation stands atop Mount Mikkelsberg. Officially dated to 1863, supposedly erected by King Ludwig I and designed by famous architect Leo von Klenze for the 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Nations near Leipzig. The architecture boggles the imagination. A huge cylinder 60 meters high topped with a dome, decorated with giant statues symbolizing the 18 tribes, the progenitors of the German nation. The scale indicates exceptional importance. But step away from the guidebooks and look at the stone itself. Official historiography categorically states this memorial is dedicated to victory in the anti-Napoleonic Wars of 1813 to 1814. You would expect to see dates of battles, names of commanders, at least a mention of the defeated enemy, France, Napoleon Bonaparte. Yet neither inside nor outside this cyclopean complex is there a single concrete indication of events from the early 19th century. The inscriptions carved in marble are discouragingly abstract and philosophical. The text on the marble floor reads, "May you never forget what made the liberation struggle necessary and how it resulted in victory." It sounds solemn, but is absolutely faceless. What specific struggle? From whom were these tribes liberating themselves? When? The stone is silent. Another key inscription above the entrance portal is dedicated to German liberators and King Ludwig I. Chronological references are completely absent. Neither 1813 nor the Battle of the Nations appears. A paradox emerges. In this beautiful location stands a huge, expensive memorial whose true purpose is impossible to determine from the inscriptions. There's a strong impression we're observing not a monument to a specific war, but a universal structure to which convenient historical meaning was assigned retroactively. Specially trained people simply appointed this temple as a monument to the War of 1813, though its architecture and inscriptions contain no confirmation of this version. This strange trend of building or repurposing giant complexes decades after supposed events isn't a local German phenomenon. Return to Russia and look at the most important sacred structure supposedly dedicated to young victory over Napoleon, the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, and you'll discover its real construction history diverges even more dramatically from official dates, completely breaking usual chronology of memory. The Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow is the largest and perhaps most controversial link in this chain. In official historiography, this colossal cathedral is presented as the main monument to the Patriotic War of 1812, a symbol of Russian gratitude for salvation from Napoleonic invasion. Everything should be clear and documented here. We're talking about the sacred center of the empire. But when you compare dates and study real chronology of construction, a picture emerges that destroys usual perception of time. Officially, the temple was built for decades and consecrated in 1883, already 70 years after expelling the enemy. That's a huge period for a victory monument, but even this date raises doubts when you turn to objective evidence from the early 20th century. Documentary confirmations from 1907 clearly show that work on the exterior decoration was still not completed. The building that was supposed to become a symbol of triumph in the 19th century still represented an unfinished construction site in the early 20th century. This means the temple in its finished canonical form opened for believers practically by the centennial jubilee of the war, an incredible situation. The main monument designed to immortalize the events of 1812 was being finished and put into operation a century after the events themselves. It's as if monuments to World War II began opening en masse only in the middle of the 21st century. Such delay defies logical explanation within the framework of traditional historical memory. All these facts lead inexorably to one conclusion. It was the turn of 1912 to 1913 that became the starting point for a new historical paradigm. For some unknown reason, it was in the early 20th century that a powerful state machine launched to propagate and update the history of war with Napoleon. An active information campaign began. Nameless triumphal arches were urgently assigned heroic names, with new plaques bearing necessary dates. Long-term construction projects that had stood for decades were completed in emergency mode, adjusting openings to the round date. German memorials with vague meanings were attributed to specific anti-Napoleonic victories. History was being created here and now before the astonished public. The century-long silence was filled with noise of solemn openings. But when history is written in a hurry, 100 years after real events, mishaps and semantic errors are inevitable. Ideological architects of victory sometimes didn't notice that symbols they used carried completely different meanings. In pursuit of scale, they missed details that upon careful examination turned patriotic monuments into something ambiguous, sometimes frankly contradictory to the official version of victory. Among monuments solemnly opened in the Jubilee year of 1913, the monument in Smolensk deserves special attention. Officially, this sculptural composition is interpreted patriotically. At the top of a cliff, two mighty eagles symbolizing united Russian armies protect their nest from a Gaul in armor climbing up. The Gaul personifies the Napoleonic army. The plot intends to show impregnability of Russian strongholds. However, deeper cultural analysis reveals an ancient European legend that turns the meaning upside down. According to these legends, a young warrior, to prove valor and become a man, was obliged to perform a daring feat, climb a high rock, and steal an egg from an eagle's nest. If you view the monument through the prism of this myth, then before us is not humiliation of the enemy, but glorification of his insane bravery. In 1913, a monument was erected in a Russian city that can be interpreted as an ode to valor of a French soldier who challenged the elements. The fate of this monument in the Soviet era adds more mystery. In 1917, the new government, known for fighting imperial symbols, behaved illogically. A bronze map of Russia with the inscription, "Grateful Russia to Heroes of 1812," was dismantled from the monument, but the double-headed eagles themselves, the main symbol of autocracy, were left untouched. If the Bolsheviks needed non-ferrous metal, they would have sent massive bronze figures of birds and heavy wreaths to be melted down. But only the map disappeared. This suggests the issue wasn't material, but information depicted on this map. Perhaps borders of states or geography itself didn't correspond to the version of history being established in the 20th century. The map was returned only in the 50s, probably already in corrected form. An even more flagrant historical dissonance can be found at Tsarskoye Selo, where cast-iron gates were installed, supposedly in 1817. The monument bears the touching name, "To My Dear Comrades in Arms," dedicated to victory in the patriotic war. At first glance, nothing seditious. The emperor thanks the army. But the devil is in placement of inscriptions. The text in Russian, addressed to his own soldiers, is placed on the inner side of the gates, essentially in the backyard. But on the grand front side that everyone approaching sees, the exact same phrase is embossed in French. This creates an absurd situation, with no analogues in world practice of memorials. Imagine a monument to Soviet soldiers in Berlin where the main congratulatory inscription is made in German. Unthinkable. In history of wars, the winner never immortalizes triumph in the language of the defeated aggressor, certainly not in the most prominent place. The fact that the face of this monument speaks French makes you wonder who actually dictated terms of peace and who was the true beneficiary of that war. To sort out this chaos of meanings, we need to examine the man who designed key buildings of that era in Russia and Germany. His work is saturated with such strange aesthetic, as if he drew inspiration from another reality or saw a future inaccessible to his contemporaries. Leo von Klenze, the brilliant German architect, defined the appearance of many European cities, but left behind a trail of insoluble riddles. He's credited with creating the most mystical structures on German soil. Valhalla near Regensburg, an exact copy of the Greek Parthenon arising in the middle of Bavarian forests. The Glyptothek and Propylaea in Munich. Looking at his works, there's a persistent feeling this master didn't live in the 19th century, but was teleported from deep antiquity. Everything his hand touched instantly turned into majestic decorations of the ancient world, absolutely ignoring realities of the era in which he created. But Klenze's influence wasn't limited to German lands. He made a colossal contribution to the architectural appearance of St. Petersburg, designing the new Hermitage building with its famous portico and Atlanteans. An architect of this level, who personally visited the Russian capital and worked by order of the emperor, should have been well versed in cultural codes and traditions of the country for which he was building. But here we encounter an artifact that literally blows the mind. There's a sketch project developed by Leo von Klenze, which he called the Russian Church. You'd expect to see onion domes, crosses, characteristic Byzantine or Old Russian forms. But what the German architect proposed has nothing to do with orthodoxy or Christianity in general. The design looks like a futuristic object from science fiction, a complex engineering structure resembling a technical hub, a power station, or a spaceport terminal rather than a house of prayer. The geometry of forms, proportions, the general silhouette, all evoke associations with high technologies or alien architecture, but not with church architecture of the 19th century. How could a man who walked along Nevsky Prospect and saw the Kazan and St. Isaac's cathedrals propose something so alien? Or perhaps in his reality, the Russian style looked exactly like that. This sketch looks like a memory from the future when the concept of traditional religion hadn't yet formed, or conversely, like an echo of a highly developed civilization of the past, whose functional buildings later began to be perceived as cult objects. Klenze seemed not to know what Russia should look like, and offered his own technocratic version, which remained on paper, rejected by the Conservative Council. But if von Klenze's paper fantasies can be written off as creative search or eccentricity of genius, then the ideas of German builders of the early 20th century, materialized in concrete and stone, cannot be ignored. What they erected in Leipzig for the centennial jubilee of the Battle of the Nations goes beyond any architectural style and common sense. If Klenze's sketches simply surprise, then this realized project causes instinctive awe and a feeling of touching something completely non-human. This is where we arrive at the structure I showed you at the beginning, the culmination of the entire chain of historical and architectural oddities. The monument, erected in Leipzig, Germany, solemnly opened in that same significant year of 1913, officially called the Monument to the Battle of the Nations. At first glance at this structure, any associations with classical architecture of the 19th or early 20th century instantly evaporate. Before the viewer appears not a graceful obelisk, not a triumphal arch, but a gloomy mountain of concrete and stone, suppressing with its power. 91 meters high. With its outlines, this dark ziggurat resembles a fortified bunker of an ancient civilization, or, if you like, an alien base from the dark cinematic universe, rather than a memorial in honor of cavalry charges and cannon volleys. The exterior causes anxiety, but what's hidden inside its massive walls plunges you into real shock. The interiors look like sets for a high-budget science fiction movie about contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. Huge statues of guardians, devoid of human emotions, line up in a circle around the dome, gazing at visitors with frightening indifference. Sculptural groups, allegorically depicting people's strength or strength of faith, represent strange scenes where small human figures trustingly press against giant non-human entities. But the most mystical element is the so-called crypt with a warrior. This room evokes direct visual parallels with shots from Ridley Scott's film Prometheus. The stone figure lying in the center of the hall and masks of guardians surrounding it look incredibly modern and technological, as if this is not a tribute to soldiers of the past, but a stasis chamber for travelers between worlds. It's hard to believe such aesthetic could be born in the head of an artist in 1913, without influence of images that would become understandable to humanity only a century later. The semantic content of this gloomy temple raises no fewer questions than its visual imagery. The name, Monument to the Battle of the Nations, sounds like evil irony if we recall real historical context of the battle near Leipzig. Official history states that in that battle, Germans fought on both sides of the front. Saxon troops supported Napoleon while Prussia and Austria opposed him. On the fields near Leipzig, the German nation was engaged in self-destruction. Brother killed brother. And in honor of this bloody feud where the nation was split, a cyclopean monument is erected glorifying unity and power. To whom is this necropolis actually dedicated? What nations or entities did the creators have in mind when designing this Hall of Eternity? This entire grandiose construction, saturated with symbolism of death and rebirth, seems completely alien to human history of the early 20th century. It stands out from the general row, screaming about its different origin or different purpose. When you put all the details together, from Moscow's long-term construction projects to the Leipzig Colossus, from rewritten plaques on triumphal arches to strange dates of monument openings, a frightening and consistent picture begins to emerge. Behind the lush facades of the Jubilees of 1912 to 1913, they tried to hide something global from us, replacing real memory of a catastrophe with a beautiful but hastily composed legend. Gathering all scattered fragments of this historical puzzle, we inevitably arrive at a single denominator. The year 1912. This date becomes the key assembly point for all official historiography of the 19th century. All the oddities, inconsistencies, and architectural anomalies we examined cease to seem like accidental errors if we look at them as elements of a single global plan. There's a strong impression that it was in the early 20th century that a gigantic machine launched to create correct memory. World elites of that time seemed to suddenly remember and in a unified impulse began a massive campaign to legitimize events of a century ago, creating material evidence where there was none or changing meaning of existing objects. This process resembled a grandiose theatrical production where scenery was erected right before actors walked out. Nameless antique gates standing all over the world were urgently given biographies and hung with plaques bearing names of necessary commanders. Long-term construction projects that had been an eyesore for citizens for decades were completed in a rush, adjusting completion dates to a beautiful jubilee. Strange, technologically complex structures whose true purpose was forgotten or lost were assigned the status of memorials, though their appearance and internal energy contradicted any logic of military memory. The year 1912 became that paper screen that fenced off the real past, replacing it with a beautiful but artificial myth about the War of 1812. Why wait a whole century? The answer is cynical but simple. Time is the falsifier's best ally. By 1912, not only participants in those events were guaranteed gone, but also their children and even grandchildren who could have heard truth firsthand. No witnesses remained. The field for creativity became absolutely clean. In the absence of living memory, history could be rewritten from scratch, adjusting facts to political needs of new empires. Perhaps behind magnificent celebrations of the Victory Jubilee, they hid consequences of a certain global catastrophe of the 19th century, about which we're forbidden to know. That very catastrophe which destroyed the old world, leaving behind ruins, buried cities, and strange non-human structures that were later called monuments. Think about what we've uncovered. Monuments that appeared a century too late. Inscriptions that were added in 1912, not 1812. Architectural styles that belong to no known period. Symbolism that contradicts the official narrative. A German architect designing Russian churches that look like spaceports. A memorial in Leipzig that resembles an alien temple more than a war monument. All of this coordinated, all of this happening simultaneously across multiple countries as the 20th century began. The history of the War of 1812, in the form we know it, is apparently a high-quality information product, a construct of the early 20th century. We were presented with a romanticized version of events with heroes and balls to hide behind it, something much more terrible and grandiose. We live in a reality constructed 100 years ago. We accept as historical truths what was written in the offices of ideologues on the eve of World War I. And the silent granite and concrete colossi scattered across Europe and Russia continue to keep their secrets, remaining the only witnesses, albeit renamed ones, of what actually happened. These structures weren't built to commemorate a war. They were built to commemorate something else entirely, something so significant, so world-changing, that it required a complete rewriting of history to hide it. The monuments are still standing, still holding their secrets. The question is whether we're ready to see them for what they really are.